Hello, everyone, joining us online to the first day of confirmation, September 20th, 2020. And you'll note partway through this recording that there will be a scene change over into the multi-purpose room because for whatever reason, the first part of this recording got lost. So I am just redoing it. And unfortunately, we won't have some of the answers and things that were given by the class, but I'll try to bring those up when I can remember them. And you can certainly stop and discuss those things yourselves. I'll still pose some of those same questions and try to recap some of the discussion that we had along the way. But to start off, just to say to all of you that I didn't get to talk to in person, I'm really excited for this class for confirmation here today. I'm really excited to get to work with you, to grow alongside you, to learn with you. And I think that, you as youth, as junior hires, have a really important role to play here as you're going through confirmation and in the church. You have a place here at Light of the Hills, you belong, and the body of Christ here at Light of the Hills is not complete without you here. So you're important, you matter. Just like in a real body, if we didn't have toes or we didn't have a heart or we didn't have lungs or something like that, we wouldn't be complete if we were missing some of those things. And the church here is not complete without you either. And so I just want to encourage you in that regard. You're not just the church of tomorrow or the future, you're also the church of today. And so you have an important role to play. And I'm really excited to grow alongside you, to get to know you a little bit better, to learn about your interests and hobbies and what you like to do, and to see you grow in your faith and in love towards your neighbor as well. And I know that confirmation is something we're adding to our already busy plates. I'll say that up front. I know that there's a lot going on in people's lives right now, and so I really appreciate your participation. And we're going to do our best to try to make this easy for you guys to work with you. But it is important. It is an important step forward in faith. And so we'll do our best to try to work with life events and those sorts of things and to accommodate family needs and all that. So I want to say that up front. Just reach out in the midst of all this if you need anything along those lines. But with no further ado, we're going to go ahead and launch into the syllabus, because it is kind of syllabus orientation day. So, and this syllabus and other materials will be sent out via email on Monday. But as you'll see at the top of the syllabus there, and you can see on the slide, the purpose of confirmation is to cultivate our youth in the historic Christian faith through faithful teaching or catechesis of the Old and New Testaments, the Bible, right? And when we talk about the historic Christian faith, what we're really just talking about there is the faith that has gone all the way back to the beginning of Jesus' ministry. It's the same faith that Jesus taught his apostles. It's the same faith that the apostles passed down to us. And so that's the faith that we're talking about. And that fancy word you see there, catechesis, you go, what is that, right? Well, catechesis comes from Greek, and it basically just means to echo back. And you think about kind of the teaching of Christianity echoing down through the centuries to come all the way to us today, and then we echo it back as well. Just like an echo would kind of bounce around in a cavern or something like that. If you've ever been to an old cavern and been able to shout, echo, 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 right? The generations echo back the faith to each other and to God and to the world around them. And so we're learning to repeat back, to echo these teachings in confirmation that God has ensured have come down to us. He wants us to know these things. So he's safeguarded those through the centuries. As you probably know, confirmation class here at Light of the Hills is a 2-year program for our youth entering into junior high so that they can more fully live in the faith which was given to them in their baptisms. And upon completion, students will be able to do at least 3 things. They'll be able to explain the basic teachings and foundations of the Christian faith. They may not have everything figured out, right, guys? We're all still learning. Pastor Allen and I are still learning too. We're all students of the Bible. But you'll have a better understanding of kind of the big picture stuff, right? You'll be able to sort of point out landmarks in the scriptures and those sorts of things and know your way around it a little bit. Number two, you'll grasp how the different scenes of scripture fit together in a unified narrative that climaxes in Jesus' saving work. So you've got all these different scenes, all these different sort of pieces of the script throughout scripture, different chapters like in a play, and we're going to see how those actually fit together really, really well. And sometimes it seems really complex and hard to understand. You go, why is this in here? Right? How does that all fit together? And that's not to say there aren't difficult passages in the Bible still, but we're going to see how they actually flow together really, really well. And that can be kind of fun when you start picking up on those connections. It starts to reveal a bunch of stuff to you, like treasures and things like that. Number three, we're going to be equipped to act out our part in God's history, because history is his story. We're going to be equipped to act out our part in God's history today as we embark on a lifelong journey of faith toward God and service toward our neighbors. Because the truth is that God's story isn't done yet. God put you in this time, in this place, in this age where you live with your family and the people around you to play a part in his story. And that's an exciting thing for us when our eyes are open to that and we start seeing all those possibilities and the ways that God works in us and then for us and also through us out into the world. So our dates for confirmation classes are going to run for the 2020-2021 year from September 20th, today, to March 21st, 2021. And there will be some days that will take off for holidays and so forth, and those are on the schedule, which will be sent out, and there will be a screenshot of that later on in this PowerPoint as well. But we'll meet on Sundays from 12:45 p.m. till 2:15 p.m. in the Education Building's multi-purpose room downstairs. And so if you are able to join us for that, we would really encourage you to do that. We have a relatively small group, I think about 7 or 8 kids total. So there's plenty of room for us all to space out if you can make it and still keep safe and all those sorts of things. But for those of you that are not able to make it, we understand, and these sessions will be put up on YouTube on the Monday following the class. You can see there the basic class time structure. I won't go through all of that. That might vary depending on the specific day and activities, but that'll give you a good idea of the general flow there. Some notes about food. Because of the pandemic that is still going on, we are not having families bring food for everyone else for other families, but we would ask that parents bring a snack or a light lunch for their students to eat during confirmation. We're fine with them eating while you're here, as long as they're able to pay attention. And so we ask parents to just take care of that beforehand so we don't have anybody getting lightheaded because they haven't had lunch yet or anything like that. Some basic materials for the class. Each student will be given these and is expected to bring them to class. We have a few loaners, but we appreciate it obviously if we don't have to be doing that every week because we might not have enough for everyone if we all forget. So the things you'll need are a Faith Alive Student Bible. That's the English Standard Version. A small catechism. 2 mechanical pencils, which we're happy to give out for you there to take notes and stuff. And then relevant lesson packets from the Divine Drama student workbook. And we won't be using that workbook every single week, but I'll make sure to email or hand out paper copies of that the week prior to you needing it, so that you have that. Let's see. I'm trying to think if there was something I was forgetting there, but I don't think so. Oh, if you do not have any of these materials, please email me, call me, let me know, and I can get those to you for those of you that were not present with us today in person. We talked about that. Also, in addition to bringing your materials, students are required to turn in sermon notes and memory work, and those will be pretty consistent. We'll talk about those a little more below. Sometimes I'll give kind of reflective assignments or a reading assignment, read this chapter of the Bible or something like that as well. But those will just be assigned the week prior. Expectations for students. Confirmation class marks the beginning where you learn about what you believe and why you believe it. Since your faith in Jesus is given to you in your baptism, and it shapes who you are, right, and how you act, it tells you your identity in Christ as a child of God and how you're supposed to act as a child in God's household, we're supposed to take class seriously. We take church seriously. And so there will be quizzes and classwork and memory work and things like that. But that said, this is kind of a grace place, if you will. There's no letter grade attached to confirmation. So if you are, you're not going to have to worry about, oh no, I'm 0.0000001% or something below where I need to be. There's none of that. It's a pass-fail system here. And there's abundant grace. We're happy to work with you guys, especially because we know these are difficult times. But at the same time, we expect you not to take advantage of that and to apply yourselves and take it seriously, because we really want to see you learn and grow, and we want what's best for you, and that is to grow in your faith. And so please make sure, parents or students, to ask plenty of questions and to focus on learning and not just passing the assignments there, right? I'm more focused on whether or not you're learning than just checking off a box in that way. And so if you guys need help with something, we need to mix something up for a learning style or anything along those lines, or if you're just having a tough time with school, you're kind of overwhelmed with other stuff going on in life, let me know. And I'm more than happy to work with you guys on those sorts of things. But I can't help if I don't know those things either. So please, please, please ask questions and reach out. But at the end of this 2-year process, if you're in your second year, then Pastor Allen and myself will determine if you're ready to make a public confession of your faith in front of the congregation or not. And that depends both on your engagement in class and fulfilling the assignments and things like that, as well as potentially an examination in front of the pastors, myself and Pastor Allen, and the elders potentially, just depending on how our year shapes up with everything going on with the pandemic. But that's why we expect you to pay attention and do the work, is because you can't be confirmed if you're not ready for it. So, along the way, here's what's expected of you. Be on time to class, be in your seat and ready to go by 12:45 p.m. Have memory work completed by the start of class, so be ready to go. Don't come in kind of frantically cramming. You can check if you're there early or something like that, but it's probably not going to work too well if you're trying to memorize for the first time in the 2 minutes before class. At least not for most people, not for me. Turn in all required sermon notes. There will be 2 of those required a month. We'll talk about that more later. And again, ask plenty of questions. There's no sincere question that will offend us or be off limits. As many of you, maybe some of you know, I didn't grow up a Christian. I wasn't a Christian when I first started coming here to Light of the Hills. And so I understand, I remember what it's like to have doubts about all this stuff, to have questions, to have uncertainties, and all that sort of stuff, and to be worried about, well, will that be a stupid question? Is that too silly? Am I asking a bad question? No, If it's a sincere question, don't be afraid to ask it. I'm not going to be offended, and there's nothing that's off limits if it's a genuine question that you have that way. So I'm happy to talk with you and answer those. So don't feel worried about asking those sorts of things. I've probably asked sillier questions than you have along the way. I used to knock on Pastor Allen's door and come to him with a list of all sorts of questions I had for him that we'd talk about. In addition, students, I'm not going to go over each of these in detail, but kind of, again, this is a grace place here, right? And the cardinal rule probably of the classroom is you have a lot of freedom. I like to give you guys freedom and trust. And so you can use that freedom to do anything you want pretty much, as long as it doesn't cause a problem for someone else. So if it doesn't cause a problem with me teaching or disrupting the class, right, then you guys can, I trust you to behave yourselves and to do the right thing and to be engaged. And I don't like to micromanage those sorts of things. I want to trust you guys. And so I think if we kind of follow these rules, then we should be fine. And I don't really foresee problems that way. If you know you are going to be absent, then please notify myself as soon as possible, or have your parent do that. And I understand there are unforeseen circumstances, but please do your best to keep me informed at the email address down there below, pastor.weeks@loth.org, or give me a phone call. And absence does not excuse classwork or required makeup work. We may push back due dates and things like that, but it will come due before the end of the year in order for you to meet the requirements for confirmation class. Expectations for parents. Parents, there's a reason that the fourth commandment is put in there in the Bible: honor your father and mother, right? And it's not put in God's law kind of haphazard or carelessly. It's the fourth commandment. It comes early in the list. And it comes in between those commandments, talking about our relationship with God and our relationships with others, kind of implying, parents, that you're really responsible for passing on the faith to your children. And the Bible talks about that in a lot of different places. I won't go into exactly, but you can research that. But there's a recognition in the Bible that's been borne out by research now over and over again, that the most influential force on kids is not the pastor. It's not the Sunday school teacher. It's not the DCE, right? It's not friends even. It's the parents. And so you, parents, have the greatest impact on forming your children's faith. And that can kind of be a blessing or a curse, right? To quote Uncle Ben in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. And what is encouraging for you guys is that a lot of times these studies and anecdotal stories too, kids don't necessarily remember what their parents said to them. You don't have to have all the answers or get everything right. But kids do watch to see if you take the faith seriously, if it's a regular part of your life or not. And if you talk about it, if you take an interest in it, if you make sure to prioritize your time around it and those sorts of things. And so if you do that, you have a big chance to influence your kids in really the most important way possible for them. There's nothing more important than your kid, your child, knowing the promises of Jesus, of forgiveness and salvation and of eternal life. You want your kids to have that. And so I just want to encourage you to engage in confirmation, even if you're not present, and you're more than welcome to sit in on the class, but to ask your children or your child or children questions about what they're learning, about how it changes the way maybe that they think about different things, to follow up on it through the week, see how can we apply this All those sorts of things. What does it teach us about God or ourselves? Those are all good discussions to be having. And so that's kind of point number one there. And there's a long list of other things there where you can help. But the main thing is to be engaged, because your kids will take notice and they will remember, even when you don't think that they will. What you can expect from the teacher, from me. So obviously at Light of the Hills, we take instruction of our youth here very seriously, and we promise to be prepared to teach your children when they come to class. We'll always strive to keep the schedule that we've outlined and live according to the standards that have been set for our students. And in addition to preparation for class time, the teacher will also work with you as much as is possible to accommodate life events and family needs. So if you have questions or concerns, again, please ask, and the earlier the better. I'm happy to work with you. I'm happy to make accommodations. I just do need to know about them in order to do that, and the earlier the better. I'll notify the parent or guardian if there are issues with their children. Whoops. And looks like that just skipped ahead. And the way this program works, I cannot go back. But the other things that were on there, looking at my paper copy, were that I'll record the class and put it up on YouTube, as I noted before. I'll submit a progress report before the first class of 2020, so probably before Christmas or around then. And then make time outside of class to answer questions or concerns, reply to emails, and give advance notice of schedule changes. Where there is memory work each year, and this year as well, and we have a handout that's been sent out to you with the different dates and the memory work that's been assigned. That's an important part of this, is to let God's word soak into us. And really this year, in part because of the virus and everything, I know there's a lot of Zoom fatigue, so we're going to be focusing in some ways less on testing the kids for the quantity of information they know, and we're going to try to focus more on the story. It's the Bible year, but also on actually reading and absorbing God's word, and on relationships and conversation. And so memory work is a really important part of that any year, but especially this year, I think, to be able to let God's word dwell in us and shape us and kind of be the lenses through which we look at life. And so we'll have those assigned memory verses. Students are to have it memorized by the start of class, have their memory work card with the corresponding date signed by a parent, signifying that they've memorized and repeated it out loud. And it's kind of the honor system there. And so parents and kids, you know if you're actually doing it or not. If you need an extra week, if it's been difficult or something like that, I'd rather honestly have you push it off if you can. And maybe, and just tell me, hey, this was a tough week for whatever reason. Can I try it next week? And we can do that. But I'd rather actually have you learn it that way and not just kind of fudge it that way. I'll sometimes have quizzes at the start of class on memory work and what we maybe learned the past week, fill in the blanks and things like that to help you, give you little prompts. And sometimes on several weeks back, from the verses several weeks back, just so that we keep those in mind and we don't just put them in the short-term memory bank. There will be sermon notes as with years past, because we expect students now to kind of start to engage the finer parts of the worship service as they're learning more about the Bible. Maybe they'll be able to pick up on some more things and appreciate some of those different parts of preaching. And so the confirmation student is expected to pay attention to worship and to fill out 2 sermon notes a month and turn in each month's notes by the first Sunday of the following month. If a student is visiting a different church, an outline can be filled out for that sermon and the bulletin stapled to the outline, and then you can put the copies of the sermon form in the box outside the door of my office. And forms can be found online under the Confirmation tab on our website. They can be found outside my office door, or I can get more for you, or you can pick them up at confirmation class as well. I'll always bring some. Just a quick note on filling out the sermon forms with law and gospel. There are 4 basic questions on the sermon notes form there. And so if you look at that, when you pull it out, maybe pause it and find it and pull that out. The second question is, where did you hear the law in the sermon? And then the third question is, where did you hear the gospel in the sermon? And sometimes those can get kind of easily confused, right? And so I just wanted to take a moment to clarify, if you kind of need a cheat sheet and you want to write this down, starting with the gospel there, the gospel, one way to differentiate that pretty quickly is the gospel is always something that God does, right? The gospel is not something that we do. It's the grace and forgiveness and love of God, his mercy towards us. He does things we don't deserve or we haven't earned. And so, for example, while I might tell the truth, or you might hear a pastor talking about telling the truth, and that's good, that's not something God does. That's not his gospel, his good news to me. Or if I am merciful to someone else, if I forgive them, say, then it might be kind of related to the gospel in that I'm telling them about what God does, but the fact that I did it doesn't necessarily make it the gospel. The gospel is always God's gracious work, his merciful work to and for us in Jesus Christ. So hopefully that makes sense. The law, on the other hand, tends to center around the sinfulness of people, as you see there on the sheet. Now, that doesn't mean the law is always bad. You could hear, again, in the sermon, the pastor telling you not to lie. And, truth-telling, if I tell you, tell the truth, that's not bad, just because we sometimes take it and twist it and then tell a lie. And in the same way, if I tell you to care for your neighbor, and I do a bad thing by not caring for my neighbor, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden the command to care for my neighbor is bad. It just means I was bad. I was sinful there. So sometimes the law can be the ways that we have defied God's rules for our life, his commands, that we've broken those or violated those things, how we've rebelled against God's will. But sometimes it might just be talking about the things that God tells us to do, like love your neighbor, right? Take care of creation, or to give to the poor, different things along those lines, without necessarily saying exactly how we've messed up on it. So hopefully that's clear. But the law is always going to eventually center, it's God's will for our lives. God's will for creation is another way to think about law. And it's at some point can always at least be imagined how sinful people might mess up with that. Then we'll also have embodied faith opportunities throughout the year. And so confirmation students will have a few opportunities to live out their faith, because it's not all just head knowledge here. And I'm excited to, hopefully as the year goes on, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do more activities and things like that, that restrictions will loosen, and we'll have opportunities to live out our faith, and that's exciting. The first one of those is being an acolyte during worship services. And because of the restrictions right now, we're not currently doing that. And so I'm holding off on acolyte training for the time being. But down the road, we'll hopefully be able to do that. And that way it'll be a little fresher in the kids' minds. But that's one way to serve the church, to participate in worship. And it's an important one, too, so that you can help to kind of pave the way for people to hear the word of God and receive his gifts. So that's a cool thing. The second one is faith in action projects, which are service opportunities through the church or in the community on your own. And I know restrictions make it a little difficult right now, but We do hope that students can participate in at least one service project to the community and to then report back on that. There will be a form for that we'll be giving to you as well. And so that may be, for example, helping out with the food closet here at church, which does that a few Tuesdays a month. And you're welcome to join there. They'd love to have your help. And that's something you can still do even right now, as long as you arrange it and talk with me further if you're interested in that. Or maybe it's picking up a neighbor's yard, raking leaves or something like that. So think about what you might like to do along the way there. Thirdly, if circumstances allow this year, we might do some special field trips and events with some reflective exercises attached. So for example, students may be offered the opportunity to visit a soup kitchen when we're discussing caring for our neighbors. Or maybe we'll be able to attend a funeral home and a cemetery when we're talking about the hope of the resurrection. Or maybe you can come to a memorial service at church. Or maybe when we're talking about jobs and vocations and how we serve our neighbors, maybe you can come to the hospital with Pastor Allen or myself and your parents, and we can see how God works through nurses and doctors, and how he cares for the sick, and learning about the hope of the new creation and the resurrection again, and all those sorts of things. So because of current circumstances, we're not sure how those will shape up, but we are hoping for those, so keep an eye out. There is the confirmation schedule for 2020. That will be sent out as well, so go ahead and give a look at that and let me know if you have any questions. There's my contact info. Feel free to email, call the office, leave a message there, call or text my cell phone, anything along those lines. And again, feel free to email questions. All right, so moving on today, we're just going to talk briefly about creation, and we'll do a little more next week with that. But I want to talk today a little bit just to frame the biblical narrative. We're jumping into the story now, right? We get to talk, and stories are always cool. They have plot twists, they have interesting characters, they have intrigue, they have excitement, they have adventure, they have all sorts of different things. But to know a story, you got to know the beginning well. And so today we're going to look at the beginning of the story just a little bit to kind of get to know the lead actor better, to know God. And so what I want you to do now is to take a minute and try to come up with what you think the earliest act of grace is in the Bible. In other words, something that was done for someone else who didn't deserve it or doesn't earn it. So pause the video and take a moment to try to think about the earliest act of grace in the Bible. Hopefully you've come up with something. And if you're like me, the first time I heard this question, I thought, oh, it's when God forgave Adam and Eve after the fall. And it turns out that's not right, although it's a good one. It's a very good and important act of grace on God's part. But the first act of grace is actually just God creating. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, we're told in Genesis 1:1. And that's not something we normally think of as a gracious act of God. But it's gracious, it's something we didn't deserve, because as we talked about today in Confirmation Class Live, I asked, well, why is it, what makes it gracious? And one of the students said, well, we didn't exist yet. We didn't exist yet. God created everything out of nothing. There wasn't anything there. There wasn't dirt. There weren't atoms. There weren't molecules. No minerals, no plants, no trees, no blood, no skin, nothing, right? No rocks, nothing. In the universe didn't exist. God created all of that. And so if I didn't exist yet, well, then I couldn't do anything to earn God creating me. I couldn't say, look, God, at all the things I've done. I couldn't say, look at all the things I'll do, because I didn't exist yet to even know I was going to do these things, or promise what I could do, or beg, or bargain, or plea, or anything like that. God just created because he wanted to, and we couldn't earn it. And that's just kind of how God's grace works. It's always out of nothing. We don't do anything to deserve it. But God uh, created all this stuff, and I accidentally advanced a slide there, but God, when he created a sunset, or when he created a butterfly or a hawk or the grass underneath your feet, or created you, he had to think of each of those things and decide to create them. If God hadn't thought of a sunset or didn't want to create it, there wouldn't be sunsets, right? If God didn't want to create a butterfly or a flower or a pine tree, then there wouldn't be any of those things. But because God thought of each of them specifically, they exist. And God also thought of you specifically. God thought of you, and he wanted to create you. He loves you. And that means you're special. That means that that God created you in ways and with gifts and talents that nobody else has. You have a special place in God's creation. And your identity and where you belong and your purpose are all kind of rooted there. So these are important questions. So just something to kind of think about, that you're special. God had to think you up when he was creating the world. And creation really is kind of at the heart of God's identity in a lot of ways, his works of creation and redeeming creation. And throughout the Bible, there's a very simple way to tell who God is, to identify him. If you're kind of going to write out a job description for God, you can look at Isaiah 40:25 through 31 there as an example. But basically, if you created everything, you're God. If you didn't create everything, you're not God. And so in the Old Testament, the two kind of ways that the Israelites list out God's job description is, did he create everything, whoever you're talking about, as opposed to some of the different idols, Baal and those folks, those other false gods. You created everything and you rule over everything. And if you do both of those things, you're God. And they know that the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob created everything and rules over everything. That's their God, Yahweh. And as a theme, God is referenced as creator over 102 times in the Bible with that specific word, and I stopped counting after a while, honestly, because I just couldn't, it wasn't worth it to keep going, but it's all over the place as a theme. And that means that we should pay attention to it. Now, you'll see all these things on the screen there, and you've got blue supergiant stars, and you can see Jupiter's orbit and Mars's orbit. They're so small you can't even see them. That star kind of baffles imagination how big it is. And then you look at that fairy fly there on the bottom right corner there. That's the smallest insect there is. And I can't remember exactly how small it is. I'm kind of blanking on it right now. But that's under a microscope. It's, you think about a ladybug, it's smaller. You think about an ant, smaller. These things are so tiny. And God cares about the tiniest things in creation and the biggest things in creation, like those giant stars and everything in between, including you and me. And you look up at the top right there, and you see the desert there, and you could pull up mountains or forest. And God created the beautiful parts of creation, and he created the parts that aren't so beautiful, like the desert, that we might not think are very valuable. But God values the things that look beautiful to us and the things that we don't even value as much. God values all of it. All of it is special to him. All of it he created by grace, including you and me. You can see that picture of us there. in that next photo of people like you and me. And so that helps us to remember, well, as we're going around and we're looking at the world, we're looking at our fellow creatures, fellow people who are also creatures, and we're looking at creation, well, if we can treat those things with love and respect, because if God created it, he loves it. If he called it out of existence, if it was important enough for him to think up and to put into this world, well, then we can honor God and his creation by taking care of it and loving and respecting those parts of creation and others, and ourselves as well, because you're valuable too. God thought you up. If you look at the first article in the Creed, it says, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. And I won't read the explanation, but if you look in your small catechism, Luther lists out a whole bunch of different things God gives us: eyes, ears, our brains, our talents, our gifts, all that stuff. And we talked a little bit in class about different gifts people have, being able to bounce on the trampoline, somebody said, and do flips, being able to play soccer, sports, being able to speak. And God had to give you everything you needed for all those things. He had to give you lungs to breathe in air and speak, and bones and muscles and all that sort of stuff. And God gives us so many things. He gives you parents. He gives you food. He gives you shelter, all sorts of different stuff in our lives. And Martin Luther kind of would tell kids in his day, he'd say, hey, you know when you're walking home from school and you see a cow and the cow moos to you? He says, I want you to pretend that the cow is saying to you, rejoice and be glad, for I bring you milk and butter from God. Because he recognized that all these different parts of our life around us we take for granted are actually gifts coming from God, because God gives us gifts in his creation. And when you pass by the apple tree, he said, think, rejoice and be glad, I bring you apples, food from God, and firewood too. And you could do that for the sunshine. You could do that for the blue skies, without smoke that we're having. You could do that with your parents. You could even do that with your siblings. I know I'm asking a lot there, right? But all these gifts that God gives us that we kind of take for granted. And as we talked about in class, when you start to look around at gifts, when you're having a bad day, or you take those things for granted, it helps you to be in a better mood when we're thankful, when we remember the good things that we have in life. And like if I'm having a bad day and somebody does something nice to me, they say a nice word of encouragement, or they bring me a coffee or food or something like that, well, then that really can kind of help us. And it's helpful for us when we're mindful of all the gifts that we have in life. It helps us to remember our place in life and all the things we have to be thankful for, and to remember that we're creatures who live under the care of a good and gracious and loving Creator. Real briefly, we talked also about the difference between a painting and an engineer blueprint there. And a blueprint kind of tells you more about how something works, how it's built. But on the other hand, a piece of art is very personal. It's very concrete, and it reflects with gratitude on the world. And, I think that we can kind of look at creation that way and how God has designed it. Sometimes there's a tendency nowadays to kind of just view creation in the world around us in terms of nuts and bolts and mechanical parts and all that sort of stuff, how it works. But when you step back and you look at a mountain vista, or we talked about looking at a flower, have you ever looked at a flower and seen all the different patterns in there on the flower? It's incredible, the detail there. Or a butterfly's wings, the intricacy there. or a sunset, you realize creation is kind of a work of art. It's God's work of art. And he's made it beautiful. He's made you and I with love and care. And he didn't have to do that. He could have just made a flower functional so that it absorbs CO2 and turns it into oxygen, right, and does its job. And he could have made it incredibly ugly. He could have made it gray sludge. But he made it beautiful. And he made creation all over the place beautiful, with lots of diversity and lots of things to wonder at, to be in awe at as we look around. And so that's just kind of a neat thing to think about as you maybe go on a walk today. Look at the sunset. Look at God's art all around you, the care that he's lavished on us. And think about, how does that change your view of the world? Even with all the bad stuff happening, God still sustains that. He makes it beautiful. And what does that say about our Creator? Now, if God is the Creator, if he's fashioned us like clay, like pottery, as the Bible talks about, then we are creatures. And if we're creatures, then we don't kind of get too big for our britches. We remember that we're fellow creatures alongside animals and alongside other people, that we're creatures in creation, and we're creatures under a creator. And so we remember, if we're under a creator, well, then we shouldn't abuse creation, right? We shouldn't engage in poaching or in destroying the environment or all those sorts of things. And in Genesis, in the early chapters there, right, we hear about how God said that man would be created in his image. In other words, like if you look at a picture or a painting or a sculpture, an image like one of those, a piece of art, reflects the original subject. So if I have a picture of Yosemite or the mountains, it reflects those mountains. And in the same way, you and I are to reflect God, his love and character and grace, integrity, his courage, his compassion, his honor, his generosity, all those things to creation. And if we remember that we're creatures, then we don't start to think more highly of ourselves than we should. And we treat others with respect and with humility. So maybe talk over those questions with your family. How does remembering you're a creature help you to be more humble or more generous, or to take better care of others? And what's the danger in forgetting we're creatures? Well, we see that in Genesis 3, right? Where Adam and Eve try to become God. And we'll talk about that next week a little more. So, after finishing creating the universe in Genesis, God has pretty much stopped his creative work. A lot of people would say, true, yeah, creation's done, right? God made it, and that's it. Well, not quite, right? Because, you look at gravity, right? And we talked about, why do we not just kind of jump up and down and then end up going through the ceiling? If you do some jumping jacks right now, why do you come back to Earth? Why do you not bounce up and out of everything to nowhere? And why does the sun shine every morning and rise in the morning? And it's because God sustains all that stuff. God sustains the world. He continues to love and to care for it. He's not done with the world, even as sinful and broken as it is. And that's really important for us to remember, that God continues to uphold the world. He sent Jesus to redeem the world, to restore it, to bring forgiveness and salvation to the world, to usher in a new creation to the world. And so God's kind of two big things he does in creation in the biblical story are always creation and redemption, or new creation. And those always go together. And that's kind of fun, because if we get lost in the scriptures, then you can say, well, I don't necessarily know what's happening here, but I know it's on the way to God redeeming and restoring and recreating all things. And it fits in there somewhere. It's on the way to recreation, to redemption in Jesus. And we see that here real quickly as Christ is the center of history. And we see that on the Old Testament side there, everybody was looking forward to Christ. On the New Testament side, everybody looks back to Christ and kind of forward in a way to when he comes again. But all history narrows down to Christ, all of its expectations. And we'll talk about that more. This is a slide we'll come back to a lot of week, this kind of bow tie there. And the P and the X there in the center is a symbol for Christ. But all of history is pointed towards Christ. And so that's important for us to remember as we read, that these aren't just isolated stories, that there is a narrative, there is a plot, and that's kind of the unifying thread. So that's it for today. Beginning next week, for homework, we've got the memorization assignments. So go ahead and do that. And then also, I'd like the students just to read through Genesis chapters 1 through 3. They can do that on their own or with the parents. And I won't test you on that per se, but just come ready to talk about that and kind of know the content, because we're going to be talking a little bit more about creation and man's fall, Adam and Eve's fall, next week. So thank you very much, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you again soon, live or virtually. God's peace.